Hi, class. I hope you all are having a great day and a great semester so far. So, as you know, I'm sure this week we are about to start reading and talking about the novel Never Let Me Go, right? Published in 2005 by Kazuo Ishiguro. So I thought I would go ahead and make a video to talk a little bit about the novel, about the genre, right, about the author, and to also give you a little bit of a head start for with the discussion questions for this week. Okay. So Never Let Me Go, Kazuo Ishiguro, right? Ishiguro is a Nobel Prize winning author, right? And he is known, right, for stories that, seem kind of quiet and maybe ordinary at first, but as we read on, right, they gradually reveal something unsettling underneath. Okay, so this novel blends literary fiction with elements of science fiction, right, and dystopia. Right. But unlike many dystopian novels, this one does not include a lot of action, right, or futuristic technology, right? Instead, it creates an ordinary, right, almost peaceful world. Yet as we read on, right, something always feels a little bit off. Okay, so in part one, right, that is our focus for this week, right? We enter Hailsham. Okay, what is Hailsham? A boarding school in the English countryside. Okay, now at first, right, the novel, it kind of seems like a typical school story, right? Students take classes, they participate in sports, they form friendships, they create art. But, right, the way the students are treated kind of starts to raise some questions. Right? Why are they monitored so closely? Right? Why is creativity so important? Okay, so we have in this book a first person narrator, right? And we come to see that her name is Kathy, right? And that she's 31 years old, right? And now she's looking back on her childhood, right, at Hailsham with a very calm, kind of nostalgic tone, right? But again, you're kind of starting to sense maybe that there's something deeper happening. Okay. So as you read, right, start to ask yourself, what feels ordinary about Hailsham, right? What feels unusual, right? And that is the mystery. That is part of the mystery, right? That makes this novel so haunting. And in my opinion, right, so difficult to put down. Okay. So this week we're focusing on part one, right? If you read ahead to part two, great, right? If you finish the book, great. But please, on the discussion board, don't include any plot spoilers, right? I feel like part of the fun of reading this book is, there's like a moment in the book where you're like, oh, that's what's going on here, right? And I don't want, that moment to be ruined for anyone who's reading it, for the first time. Also, please don't read any plot summaries before you read the book. Okay, so in this video, right, I am going to say a little bit about the genre. Okay, so I'm going to start with that. So as I mentioned, right, this book is often, classified as a work of science fiction. Okay, so let's say a little bit about that, right? Science fiction is actually one of the most popular and successful genres of literature, right? Sometimes people refer to it as speculative fiction, right? The literature of ideas, right? Because it is often, really more concerned with exploring ideas, right? Than with careful portrayals of reality, right? Often works of science fiction, right? They present an imaginary, right? A made up civilization, right? Or society in order to critique some aspect of our own civilization. Okay. And, we can also say that dystopian literature, right, it often explores the concept of humans abusing technology, right? And also how humans, both individually and collectively, cope with technology that has evolved too quickly. Okay. Now, sometimes, right, people talk about this novel, right, as being a romance novel, right? Kazuo Ishiguro often said when he wrote it, right, he thought of it as a romance novel. And so, what is a romance novel? Well, obviously it's going to focus on romance, right? Right. The conflict often has to do with a romantic relationship, right? One character has a spark, right, has love for another character. And we're wondering, oh, is that going to be reciprocal, right? Is there a love triangle? Right. So as you're reading, kind of be thinking about that, right? Is this about romance and love? Right. And then also, I think that we can view this novel as a coming of age novel. Okay, sometimes called a Bildungsroman, right? That is a German word that means novel of development. Okay, and these kinds of novels focus on the journey, right? The transition from childhood to adolescence, right? To adulthood, right? A lot of emphasis on, self-discovery, identity formation. Okay, people, slowly realizing, what their values are, what their beliefs are, what their place in the world is, right? And, certainly like loss of innocence. Okay, so as you're reading, kind of be thinking, oh, what genre do you believe this novel belongs to? Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit now about the writer, Kazuo Ishiguro. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can pull up some pictures and things for you to look at while I'm talking. Okay, so let me move me over here. Okay, so there we go. Kazuo Ishiguro. Let me present mode. Okay, so there he is. Um, And you can see he was born in 1954 in Nagasaki, Japan. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. Nagasaki, Japan, you probably know, right at the end of World War II, that is where the United States, right, in 1945 dropped an atomic bomb. Okay, so this was 3 days after the bomb at Hiroshima had been dropped. Okay, so in Hiroshima, right, the day of the bomb, 80,000 people died, right? And many more died later due to burns, radiation sickness, cancer. Okay, so then 3 days later, Nagasaki, right? And there were 35,000 people who died. Okay. Now, obviously, this is before, Kazuo Ishiguro was born, right? But he's talked a lot about how, being born in a city with that kind of a history, it had a very profound effect on him, right? And as he, was growing up, he said that he often heard stories about, what life was like before the bomb and after the bomb. Okay, so we'll kind of come back to that. So you can see, right, he became a British citizen in 1983. So when he was only 6 years old, his family moved to the United Kingdom, right, to England, because his father was a scientist, right? He was an oceanographer, and his father began research with the National Institute of Oceanography. Okay. So let me go ahead. And you can also see, right, that, Kazuo Ishiguro is a novelist. He's actually written 8 novels, right? He's also a screenwriter. And, he's written 5 screenplays, also one short story collection, as well as music, right? So initially, right, when he was in his early 20s in the 1970s, Ishiguro kind of thought he was going to be a musician, right, and a songwriter. That was his passion. However, right, he says he slowly realized that, that wasn't really the right fit for him. He didn't feel like he had enough talent, I guess, as a songwriter and a musician. And so he returned to school, right? He went to the University of Kent in Canterbury, where he got a bachelor's degree in English and philosophy. Okay, and he finished in 1978, right? And then later went back to school. Right at age 26, he got an MFA degree. That's a Master in Fine Arts. And then let me go forward here. In 1928, 28, right, that's when he became a British citizen. And you can see right on the screen, right, in 2017, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. These are some pictures, right? That is his wife on the left, his daughter on the right, right? He married when he was 32. His wife, her name is Lorna McDougall, and she is a social worker. In 2018, a huge honor, Ishiguro was knighted, right, by the British monarchy. Okay. These are some of his novels, right? Like I said, he has eight novels. So in 1982, his first book, right? A Pale View of the Hills. And this novel is narrated by a Japanese widow living in England, right? Drawing on the destruction and rehabilitation of Nagasaki. And then in 1989, he wrote The Remains of the Day, right? And that won the Booker Prize in 1989, right? It was also made into a film. And then in 1995, The Unconsoled, 2000, When We Were Orphans, 2015, The Buried Giant, and then most recently, right, his novel from 2021, Clara and the Sun. And I just recently read it. It's so good. And I'm really excited because it's going to be made into a film, right? Sony purchased the rights, right? And it stars, right, as Clara, Jenna Ortega, and also in the film is going to be Amy Adams and Natasha Lyonne. So it sounds pretty good. I'm excited for that. And then, of course, the book that we are focusing on, right, is from 2005. Like I said, Never Let Me Go. And I just put some of the different covers, on the screen. When I first read the book, I actually, saw it at the library, and I will admit I was drawn by the cover. I thought, oh, it looks kind of interesting. I'd heard of the writer, I read the book and loved it. And then I decided, oh, I'm going to use it in my class, next semester. And I was kind of shocked when I ordered the book, through the Long Beach City College bookstore. When I went to go look at it, it was the copy of the picture on the bottom right. And I was sort of like, wait, what? Did they give me the wrong book? Right? Because there's such a, in my opinion, such a difference in these two covers, right? And, that's something I think a lot about, right? How a book is packaged, kind of interesting. Okay. And then Never Let Me Go, also, you might know, was made into a film, right? A film adaptation came out in 2010, right? In the film, you can see it stars big celebrities, right? Keira Knightley, Andrew Garfield, and Carey Mulligan, right? Carey Mulligan plays Kathy. Um, and I totally recommend looking at watching the film after you finish reading the book, of course. I will say that the film version, there's some pretty significant changes, you know. And when I post the essay topics, you'll see that there is a choice, kind of like talking, again, we'll talk more about the essay later, but you have the opportunity, right, to talk about the film, right, with one of the essay topics. And then I just wanted to also just, say something about the other film adaptation from an Ishiguro novel, right? The Remains of the Day, right? That film came out in 1993 and it was very successful, right? It was nominated for 8 Oscars, right? Including Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay. So you might want to check that out. Okay, let me stop sharing my screen now. Okay, so let's keep on, talking about the books now. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about part one, just to get you started, right? And thinking about those discussion questions that I posted, right? So what is the setting? Well, as we know, right, in part one, the setting is Hailsham. Okay. And the time, right? We know, and this is a question on the quiz, right? That the time is, it says on page one, right? England, late 1990s. Okay, so hopefully you noticed that, right? So, right, so that is the present narration. But like I said, Kathy is reflecting back, right? She's remembering her childhood, right? So her memory goes back to the 1970s, the 1980s. Okay. And there are some, realistic time markers that she refers to. For example, right, she talks about the students using a Walkman, right? Cassette tapes, right? So if you were alive in the 80s, right, you maybe know what that is. Okay. So that's the time. And let's say, a little more about Hailsham, right? As I mentioned, it's a boarding school. Okay. And so we're kind of like, oh, why are these students at this boarding school? Where are their families? We'll come back to that. And is this a nice place? Like, would we want to be at Hailsham? Okay, well, we start to learn that it is considered a privilege, right, to grow up at Hailsham. Okay, so that's interesting. And then, it is very, in a very beautiful pastoral place. It seems very comfortable, right? The students, they basically have everything they need, right? But yet, we also pick up on the fact that it's very secluded, right? It's very isolated, right? It's very much cut off from, it seems the rest of the world. Okay. And so I'm just holding up my paper copy here, right? So, if you have a paper copy, right, as well as the PDF that I posted on Canvas, right, there is on page 50 in the paper copy, right, there's a really nice description of Hailsham, right? And Kathy describes the fact that it's surrounded by woods, right? Like these beautiful, woods, but she says, right, that, these woods actually create like a barrier, right? And so she talks about these stories that they hear growing up, right? Stories about the woods and stories about students who try to run off, right? So it says here, the students that ran off beyond the Hailsham boundaries. And that in one case, right, a student's body had been found 2 days later, right, up in the woods, tied to a tree with hands and feet chopped off. Right. And then another rumor had it that a girl's ghost wandered through those trees. Right. She'd been a Hailsham student until one day she climbed over a fence just to see what it was like outside. Right. And that, then she was pleading to be let back in, but no one let her. And now she's sort of like a ghost, right, haunting Hailsham. Okay. So, kind of interesting stories that they are hearing as they're growing up, right? Kind of the sense is that escaping Hailsham is forbidden, right? Is dangerous. And that if you do that, right, you could be killed, you could be, punished in some way. Okay, so that's, I think a very interesting detail, right, about the setting. Okay. Now, as I also mentioned, the point of view, it is the first person. Okay. So we are, essentially in Kathy's head, right? We only know what she tells us, right? We share all of her, limitations and prejudices, right? We only know, again, what she chooses to share with us. And, what can we say about Kathy H, right? Since she's like, it's very important for us to consider her. Well, like I said, we know that she's 31 years old, right? And the way the novel starts, she just kind of just throws us in and is talking about how, right, she is a carer and that she has been a carer for 11 years, right? So basically, since she was 20 years old. Right. And, I think the first time I read the book, we're thinking, what is a carer? What is that? Right. She doesn't tell us, right? She assumes that we know, what that is. We don't yet. Okay, so we're kind of already wondering, what is that? But we do pick up that Kathy, right? If I had to describe her personality, I think some adjectives that I would use would be kind, right? Very thoughtful, very loyal, somewhat serious, but also, right, very sensitive to the needs and the feelings of other people, right? She seems to be the kind of person who, kind of defers her own emotions, her own desires, right? And thinks a lot about her friends and their feelings and their desires, right? She tells us that, one of the reasons she feels like she's so successful as a carer, right? Because again, like I said, she's been doing it for 11 years, and we come to learn that that's kind of unusual, right? That most people don't, sort of last in that position as long as she has, and she seems to suggest that, one reason why she has lasted in that position for so long, she tells us it's because she feels for her donors every step of the way. Okay, so she really, as I said, she cares a lot about other people. Um, and I feel like the way she starts the first sentence, my name is Kathy H. I'm 31 years old, and I've been a carer for over 11 years. I feel like that's a kind of like, old-fashioned way to open a book. It's very, I think, very appropriate for this narrator, who we come to learn is very sheltered in her life, right? Her lived experience is very limited. Um, see, is there anything else I want to say about Kathy right now? Um, so I think she's also very self-deprecating. She's kind of putting herself down, right? She's very humble. She's very modest. And, I will say, in my opinion, she's also very likable, right? I do find myself really enjoying her and being inside her head and seeing the world through her eyes. I like her. Okay. Okay. So let me say a little bit now, to kind of help you out about the discussion questions that I asked for this week, right? So there's two questions, right? And as you probably noticed, one of them is asking you, right, what evidence in the novel suggests that the students are normal, just normal people, normal young people, at a school, right? Physically, in the minds of other people, right, from other people's perspectives, and from their own perspective, and also, right, since we're talking about a school, in the curriculum that they're being taught. So, what just seems normal about all those things, right? And then, right, the flip, what seems unusual, like not totally normal, right? Not typical. Okay, so we'll start with physically. Okay, so we start to see that these young people, they seem very like just normal kids, right? They are athletic. They enjoy, participating in sports, right? As they come to get a little bit older, we learn that they also, right, like most teenagers, have, sexual desire. Okay, they start to have sex. They start to have, these kinds of feelings for other people. Okay, so that seems very normal, right? And then also, in the minds of others, from the perspective of their teachers, right? They call them the guardians, right? We see that they are viewed as being capable of learning, right? They are intelligent, right? They are given an education and a healthy environment in which to grow up, right? And the guardians also assume that they're going to have sexual desire, right? And they kind of caution them, saying, "Oh, don't forget that sex affects your emotions in ways that you would never expect." Okay. Now, what can we say also that's very, seems very normal about them at the beginning of the book? Well, we see that, they're, typical young people, and that they seem to have the ability to form groups, right, with a hierarchical structure, right? Cliques, in groups, right? And we see certain characters are kind of like more, popular. For example, Ruth, she in many ways is kind of at the top of the social hierarchy. She's kind of bossy, Um, and, we also see that they feel affection, embarrassed, excited. They feel hope. They feel pride. They feel sad. They're curious, right? A big focus in part one is on the way Kathy and Tommy are very curious, right? They're always questioning things and trying to understand, right? Why did Miss Lucy say this? Right? Why is Madame taking our art? Right? What is the gallery? Right? So they're always asking questions. Right? They're very curious. And that they're very loyal as well. They have, very active imaginations. Okay, so, very, very normal kids. Okay. But what is there about them that seems not quite so normal? Okay, well, we start to pick up on some of those things as well, right? So physically, for example, we come to learn that the students have to have a medical exam every week, like a checkup, right? Something that most people do, maybe once a year. I think when you're a child, like once a year you go for a well exam, but once a week, that's a lot, right? So, why is their health so important? And then, we also learn that when they have sex, they never have to worry about pregnancy. Okay, so for some reason we don't know and we don't understand yet, right? They cannot like reproduce, they can't have children. Okay. I think it's also kind of interesting. We get so many elaborate descriptions in the book, but yet there's no descriptions of the characters' like physical appearance, right? What does Kathy look like? We have absolutely no idea. Okay, that's never given to us. Um, and also let's say something about the curriculum that they're being taught, right? What kinds of classes are they taking? Well, we seem to pick up on the fact that the main emphasis is on creativity, right? So art, right? Visual art, poetry, right? Those are things that are prioritized. Okay, so where's their math classes? Where's science, critical thinking? We don't history, right? There's no mention of that. That's a little bit unusual. Um, and I want to say a little bit about a few of the in my opinion, really important scenes from part one that really kind of sort of like start to get us thinking about why what's different about these students. Okay. So, one of the first sections that really stands out, scenes that really stands out, is on page 35 in my paper copy of the book. And that is the scene when they are kind of puzzled about Madame, right? Somebody who comes to Hailsham, not that often. Often she comes just to like look at their art and take their art. But when she comes, they've kind of started to pick up on the fact that she seems to be a little bit like standoffish with them, right? And they decide to, have this little experiment when she's walking towards the school, right? Towards them and their children, they're going to see how she responds. Okay. They get right up to her. And so we learn, right, that Madame, it says right here, I'm just going to read this passage, right? It says, it wasn't even as though Madame did anything other than what we predicted she'd do, right? When they come up to her, she just froze and waited for us to pass by. She didn't shriek or even let out a gasp, right? But we were all so keenly tuned in to picking up her response. Okay, and that's probably why it had such an effect on us. So, how did she respond, right? Well, it says that when, they kind of came right up to her, almost brushing against her, that, right, that her face, right, and her body, right, language suggested that she was afraid of them. Okay, now we might be thinking, why would an adult woman be afraid of these like children? You know, and then it says, right, that there was a shudder, that she seemed to be suppressing, right? The real dread that one of us would accidentally brush against her. Okay. Right. And then she goes on to say, right, Kathy says that Madame responded as though one would react if a spider touched them. Okay. So, just kind of wrap our heads around that for a minute, right? A spider, right? Like if a spider started to crawl up my arm, right? The first thing I would do is, get this off of me, right? I don't want a spider on me, right? And so why would Madame be responding that way to these children? Again, like why? And more importantly, how does this affect the children? Okay. So we see, right, that it says that it affects the way they perceive themselves, right? So it says, although we just kept walking, we all felt it. It was as though, sorry, we'd walked from the sun right into the chilly shade, right? And that they were a very different group than the one that had stood about excitedly waiting for Madame, right? So a few of the children like break into tears. Ruth looks shaken. And, on the next page, she says that this is a moment, right, when you realize that you really are different to them. Okay. Right. And so, that's kind of interesting. Okay. So it gets us thinking. And then another scene that I think, really further develops this also involves Madame. And so, right, the scene where Kathy is in her room and she's listening to her cassette tape, right, that has the song Never Let Me Go. Okay. And we kind of sense, oh, this is important, right? The book is called Never Let Me Go. The song she's listening to is called Never Let Me Go. Okay. So, she's listening to this song, right? And like many people, music does affect our emotions, right? And so she's listening to this song and she's holding the cassette tape, right? The pill and a pillow, kind of pretending it's a baby because she's imagining what she thinks the lyrics are about, right? She thinks that it's from the perspective of a mother, right, who's imagining she's holding a baby, right? That she had thought that she could never have a baby, and now she's holding a baby, and she's never, never let me go. Okay. And all of a sudden, right, when Kathy's having this, this moment is very private, she's alone, she senses that there's somebody watching her. Okay. And so, she turns and it's Madame. Okay. And what's very strange is, throughout the novel, up until this point, Madame seems to be this very cold person, not very emotional at all, right? And that, again, from the scene I just described, that she's almost afraid of these children, right? That she's like kind of like doesn't want to get near them. But now she's standing in the doorway and she's watching Kathy, right? As Kathy's having this very private moment, and Madame is crying. Okay, so it seems very out of character for Madame, right? These tears. And it's very confusing to Kathy, right? Why is she crying? Okay, and we don't know yet, right? We'll come back to that when we get to part 3. Okay, so that also gets us thinking, why was Madame crying? Why is she so emotional by this? Okay. And then finally, right, the scene that I think is really meaningful in part 1. And so Miss Lucy, who is, one of the newer guardians, and she seems to be the favorite guardian. Okay. And so there's a scene where Miss Lucy, right, is kind of agitated. She's upset because she seems to have a philosophical disagreement, right, with other guardians about how the students should be educated. Okay, so Miss Lucy has overheard, right, some of the students, kind of fantasizing about what they're going to be when they grow up. Right. Oh, I'm going to be a movie star. I'm going to move to Los Angeles and be a famous actor or actress. Right. Another student. Oh, I'm going to work in a grocery store. right? So they're just kind of talking like young people do, kind of imagining what they might do, right? And Miss Lucy is very disturbed by this, right? And so there's a very important scene towards the end of part one, where she says to her class of students, um, right? She says, I know you don't mean any harm, but there's just too much talk like this. Okay. And it's not right. Okay, so what? What does that mean, right? If no one else will talk to you, then I will. The problem, as I see it, is that you've been told and not told. You've been told, but none of you really understand. Okay, so then she like this idea of being told and not told, right, is very interesting because that's kind of our experience as we're reading the book, right? We're being told certain things, but also, right, not told other things. Things are being withheld from us. Okay, and then she goes on to say, right, if you're going to have decent lives, okay, then you've got to know and know properly. None of you will go to America. None of you will be film stars. And none of you will be working in supermarkets, as I heard some of you planning the other day. We're like, what? Why not? Your lives have been set out for you. Okay. Right. And then she goes on to talk about how, right, they don't have agency, right? They don't have control over their lives. Okay. And we'll get more into this when we get to part two and part three. Okay. But as you're reading this and, thinking about what Miss Lucy is saying, also notice the way the students respond, right? Imagine if you were a young person and somebody said to you, all these dreams and fantasies you have about your future, whatever your future career choice might be, you're not going to have that. It's not going to happen. I think most people would respond with anger, no, or with sadness or something, right? Some kind of an emotional response. Okay, but how do the Hailsham students respond to this, this very dramatic lecture by Miss Lucy? How do they react to that? Okay, so please notice that, as you're reading. Okay, well, I'm gonna stop now. I really, really hope that you are enjoying the novel, right? Part one, like I said, it starts off a little bit slow, right? It is it does build and become more and more interesting, right, as you read. So please, keep on reading. All right, sounds great. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.